Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name's Todd Votteler, and I'm your host for Talk+Water. I'm also the editor-in-chief of Texas+Water and the Texas Water Journal. You can sign up for Texas+Water by visiting texas+water.org, and you can sign up for the Texas Water Journal at texaswaterjournal.org. Both publications are free. Today, I'm in one of my favorite places, Whitefish, Montana, and I am here at City Beach, and I'm overlooking Whitefish Lake, and it's an absolutely gorgeous day, 75 degrees, something like that, absolutely clear. Everybody's out in the lake paddleboarding and have a great time, and I'm with my guest, John Muhlfeld, and he is the principal hydrologist of the River Design Group here in Whitefish, and he's also the mayor of the city of Whitefish. John, welcome to Talk+Water.
Pleasure to be here.
So I'm going to read a little bit about the things that you've done before we get started. So John, as I mentioned, is the principal hydrologist for the River Design Group and the mayor of Whitefish, and he has a degree in geoscience and water resources from Hobart College in upstate New York, and there he looked at the effects of non-point source contamination on Lake Seneca. In 22 years of professional experience, John has worked for the U.S. Forest Service and worked as a forest hydrologist for the state of Montana's Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. And he is now with the River Design Group, where he's a project manager and lead restoration hydrologist for numerous large-scale restoration projects in Montana, including the Odell Spring Creek and Wetland Restoration Project and the Upper Blackfoot Mining Complex, involving the headwaters of the infamous Blackfoot River. John participates in all aspects of project development, including geomorphic investigations, design criteria development, preliminary and final design, regulatory permitting, and construction management. You do it all, it sounds like. So it's great having you on, and you're a busy guy. We've been working to get our schedules to meet, and I'm glad we're finally able to do it.
Likewise.
So I always like to kind of start out with a question about, how you kind of decided that water was, what you wanted to devote your career to, or what really, got you out of bed and going every morning. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I get asked that question quite frequently, and I think I have to bring it back to my childhood. We were raised on a small coastal town in Connecticut on Long Island Sound. My grandfather was an avid sailor, competed in the America's Cup, so we were frequently as children on his boat up in Madison, Connecticut, sailing out of the Madison Yacht Club, crewing for my grandfather. My parents also, we would spend summers in upstate New York in the Adirondack State Park, Caroga Lake, New York. And it was there that I think my brother, who's actually an aquatic ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, just learned a passion for water and water resources and aquatics. We spent a lot of our summers, diving, fishing, diving for crawdads, snorkeling around the lake, sailing, of course. And from there, I watched progressively how the lake deteriorated from a water quality standpoint, largely due to septic leachate contamination, as well as the introduction of Eurasian water milfoil into those waters that came through the St. Lawrence Seaway. Unfortunately, most of the lakes in upstate New York now are infested with zebra mussels, or Dresdenia polymorpha.
Yep.
Fortunately, Caroga Lake has been spared so far. But it was from that experience, watching the deterioration in the lake water quality and the productivity, I realized that perhaps my passion in life would lie with the restoration end of things when it comes to water resources. I went to school just a mere 2 hours from Caroga Lake on Seneca Lake, so one of 5 or 6 of the Finger Lakes in upstate New York, these glacially carved water bodies, beautiful country, great vineyards if you're into that kind of thing. And I started studying geosciences with a focus in limnology and non-point source pollution investigations on Seneca Lake. So did my senior thesis on investigating the effects of agricultural development in a small watershed on lake water quality and primary productivity. So during that time, my friends and I would travel back to Caroga Lake, to my childhood summer home. And again, just progressively watching the lake continue to deteriorate. It was quite depressing, to be quite frank.
What period? How long?
That was over the period of about 15 years.
Okay.
Yeah,
wow.
that I watched it deteriorate. My parents purchased the home and when I was about 5 years old, and they sold it ultimately when I graduated college when I was about 20 years old. So over a 15-year period, a marked change in lake water quality and just the overall trophic status, of the lake and the productivity, the fisheries, the bug life, et cetera. So it was a call, I think, to some degree for both my brother and I to pursue, degrees in related fields. As I mentioned, he's now with the USGS out of West Glacier, research ecologist, and I've landed myself here in Montana as a principal at River Design Group, and we've been operating now as a private consulting firm for about 19 years.
So you grew up on the East Coast and, kind of very different water, circumstances there, getting out, I guess, in the ocean and sailing, and then the Finger Lakes, as you're talking about. How'd you decide to come out here?
Well, we had a friend that had graduated from University of Denver who raved about Whitefish. He came up here to spend one winter to, quote, ski and then go back to the East Coast and find a real job. He was driving a taxi cab at the time. My brother had moved from the University of Maine to University of Montana to finish his undergraduate degree and was spending one summer working in Libby, Montana for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, which turned into a multiple-year position. So he actually put me in touch with multiple job opportunities my senior year in college, and I was fortunate to land a position as a hydrologic technician on the Kootenai National Forest, part of the National Forest System up in Eureka, Montana. So that's what landed me in Whitefish, was that connection. And like my friend that had lived here and still does live here, I was supposed to be here for one winter, but I'm still here 26 years later.
Well, you're lucky. That's great.
Yeah, I feel very lucky that I've landed here and been able to stay. That's for sure.
So you, as I mentioned, are part of the River Design Group. So tell me what that your company does. What do y'all do typically?
So I'm one of 5 principals. We started the company back in 2003. We have offices here in Whitefish, as well as Corvallis, Oregon, and Boise, Idaho as well.
So I guess we have kind of another connection. So I'm part of a group out of Corvallis called 4 Worlds, which is a group of professors essentially that work in conflict resolution, mostly focused on water and other environmental issues. So I was just
interesting.
Throwing that in there. So the work that y'all do in the River Design Group, is it mostly focused on Montana, or are you doing do you do projects other than Montana? Or
I do. We're throughout the Pacific Northwest, so our primary focus area is the Rocky Mountain region all the way to the coast. So Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. I focus primarily in Montana and Idaho, although I frequently do travel to Oregon to assist our Oregon staff with projects. But as I mentioned, we started the company back in 2003. We were brought together under unique circumstances. We were employed by a previous or former consulting firm that really wasn't being managed very well. So we decided to hang our own shingle out and go for it. And we've been largely successful, but we're, again, a private consulting firm. We focus in water resources engineering projects, and we provide those consulting services to state and federal agencies, tribal, non-tribal organizations, nonprofits such as Montana Trout Unlimited National, and other water groups throughout the Northwest.
So the kind of restoration work you've been involved with, do you see, I mean, not just the work that you've done, but you see the projects that are going on throughout the western United States. Are there more in some states than other? I mean, I imagine there's a lot going on in California, but do you see other states in the West where there's a lot of this kind of activity going on?
It's a booming industry, and I call it the restoration, or refer to it as the restoration economy. And when we were, for example, removing Milltown Dam at the confluence of the Clark Fork and Blackfoot Rivers, I remember former Governor Brian Schweitzer coined that term, the restoration economy, and he was exactly correct in that it's really taken off not only in Montana, but throughout the West and throughout the country. I know the Southeast America has a very strong, Southeast U.S. has a very strong restoration economy similar to Montana and the Pacific Northwest. And I do only see that growing because a lot of the cleanup work that occurs, the studies, the restoration projects are largely federally mandated under the Clean Water Act, for example. Mm-hmm. And so I do not see the work slowing down. In fact, I think it's on a significant uptick.
So, there are not many of those projects in Texas yet. We published a journal article in the Texas+Water Journal about it. There's a lot of need for it. I mean, there are all sorts of small dams that, they're not really maintained much anymore, and they've outlived their usefulness. But I think, there's kind of a threshold, I guess, where you see some of them being removed, and that leads other communities to say, hey, let's do the same here. And it seems like, it's kind of out here. It's picked up momentum. I mean, you see a lot about it in the newspapers, and there are a lot of articles about it. And, people are very excited about, hey, the river's being restored, and maybe this run of, salmon or some of the fish. I mean, you see it in the East Coast too, is going to be restored. And it seems like you say that it's a phenomenon that's really picking up.
Yeah, and oftentimes we're actually approached by the actual utility to evaluate the current condition, the dam safety analysis, right. And we work with other firms to perform those studies. But largely they come to us because these facilities represent a very small percentage of their overall power portfolio. And when they go to relicense with the federal government, there are new requirements in place that they need to meet, such as, temperature, trying to mimic historical temperature regimes, flow regimes, provide fish passage, et cetera. And oftentimes these facilities have been neglected to the point where they're not only failing, but they're also a significant, safety hazard. And they pose a risk to the utility. So that's where we get involved. And obviously, our involvement also, stems from, work under the Superfund Act, where we've, removed several dams in Montana as a result of, Superfund listing.
Right. So I have to say this because my listeners in Texas who know me will say, you have to say something about that, Votteler. So I worked for the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority. And so probably the most famous, example of a little dam like that, collapsing is when part of one of our dams collapsed on video about 4 or 5 years ago. And that was on CNN it's all the time, and the other, big networks. And that was a dam that there were a series of dams, about half a dozen built between 1928 and 1932 that were small hydroelectric dams. And, the dams could be rehabilitated, but they could never provide enough hydroelectric power to pay for that work. Right. And so the River Authority was kind of in a conundrum because there's all sorts of very expensive real estate that had developed around the lakes that those dams maintain. And so, for the agency, which didn't get any revenue, from the landowners who lived around those lakes, any significant revenue. Maintaining the dam was the problem because it wasn't producing much money, and replacing it is really, really expensive. So I'm familiar with kind of that conundrum. So talk a little bit about what is kind of the process for a dam removal. What are some of the big major steps that have to be undertaken?
Well, it certainly depends on the scale and scope of the facility and the project. With projects where it's simply a dam removal and that let the river adjust naturally upstream and downstream, it's a little more simplified compared to a project such as the Milltown Dam removal at the confluence of the Clark Fork and the Blackfoot just east of Missoula, where we had to integrate our design team with the remediation team that's actually doing the waste removal upstream of the dam, as well as the removal of the actual dam infrastructure.
So these are mine wastes, and is it
in that particular example, that was mine waste that was transported down the Clark Fork River from the Upper Clark Fork River back in, I believe, 1908, 1 year after the dam was actually constructed.
What was it? A gold mine, silver, or uranium, or what?
It was Butte, Silverbow area.
Okay.
Yep, so all the above.
Gotcha.
And it essentially contaminated about 55 miles of the Clark Fork River.
Wow.
From Butte all the way downstream to Milltown Dam. And I believe in the mid-'80s, the Environmental Protection Agency detected metals in the drinking water supply in the town of Bonner, Montana, where the dam was located, which triggered the Superfund action. With Superfund or these large-scale projects, they would typically first focus on remediating the source.
Right.
And the source being the floodplain contaminants that were deposited during that 1908 flood in the Upper Clark Fork before removing the dam. But because of that hazard related to the drinking water supply of both Bonner, but also the Missoula aquifer, it triggered an immediate action by EPA, and that's what triggered the removal of that facility.
So how much? So you had to go in and y'all had to remove all that sediment, and then so how many, I guess, inches or feet of sediment did you? I mean, just kind of a ballpark.
So at the actual dam crest, there was between 20 and 30 feet in thickness of contaminated sediments that needed to be removed, and that depositional wedge that's formed upstream of the dam extended about 3 miles upstream. Wow. So we were one of several consulting firms on that project. Our primary role was, once the dam was removed and the sediments removed, our role was reestablishing, the valley morphology, the channel, and then rebuilding the actual river, the stream banks, the revegetation of the floodplain, etc. But there's a lot of uncertainty going into these types of projects, as you may be aware. We had a pretty good estimate as to the elevation and the profile of the buried floodplain surface. Again, this was buried back in the 1908 flood, which was about a 500-year flood of record in the Upper Clark Fork River watershed. So as the sediments were removed, obviously the first step was engineering a clear water bypass channel. So basically an armored bypass that would be in place for about 6 years as the sediment was removed. A majority of the sediments were loaded in train cars and haul about 3 million yards, hauled back up to repositories in the Upper Clark Fork River, basically from where the sediments came from, quite frankly. So those were, engineered repositories. They're lined and capped, etc. So as the sediment removals continued, we were basically sampling and determining what the historical buried A horizon or the soil A horizon was. And what was unique about that site is, they had logged the floodplain prior to, filling the reservoir. And so we were encountering all the old floodplain stumps, the old river terraces. So once those elevations were established, it was very much an iterative design process where we had to frequently adjust the profile of the riverbed, the profile of the floodplain through our design process to match what we were uncovering, as the sediment removal continued for about 3 years. So it was a pretty unique process. So there's always uncertainty, and there's the need to be adaptable because your initial design's not going to be what translates on the ground in some situations. So, adapting to the ground conditions that are encountered is pretty pivotal.
So like you say, I mean, there's the science and the engineering aspects of that kind of a restoration, but I imagine it's also somewhat of a kind of an art form thing too. I mean, you get a feel for what might work and how things might work. Is there any element of that to it?
Yeah, I mean, we spent about 4 years doing investigations. So I categorize those into geomorphic investigations. What did the river and the valley look like prior to dam construction? We had anecdotal records and evidence, general land office notes dating back to the late 1800s, depicting the confluence of the Clark Fork and the Blackfoot rivers. We obviously had historical imagery, but of course that didn't predate the construction or installation of Milltown Dam. We also did have some very old black and white photos taken during the actual construction of the dam that depicted a very well forested, stable river environment upstream of the dam, which there were several practitioners and educators that were claiming that this river system prior to dam construction was more of a braided, very dynamic river system. But from all accounts we could tell, it was more of a stable, dominant river channel with multiple secondary channels that would be accessed during flood flow. So those little pieces of evidence helped develop our design criteria. And more importantly, much like an architect develops a blueprint, we actually investigated river reaches on the Clark Fork River and up in the Blackfoot River watershed that were considered, quote, reference or analog reaches to what we were trying to replicate through our design process. So all the data is scalable. It doesn't matter if you're studying a 100-foot wide river and designing for a 130-foot wide river. You can make all those data dimensionless and then scale the data to develop design dimensions for your particular project. So that's basically the approach we took. Obviously, that's just more the field geomorphology component, looking at what Mother Nature's telling you. Then, of course, there's the whole aspect of the hydrology and the sediment transport considerations that need to be taken into consideration during the design process. So we spent multiple years actually sampling suspended as well as bedload, suspended sediment as well as bedload upstream of the dams on both the Clark Fork and Blackfoot rivers to, measure how much sediment, both bedload and fine sediments, are being transported through the reach, because obviously we needed to maintain with our design continuity, meaning continuity of flow, continuity of sediment transport. And so that's some of the investigations that were completed to support the design process.
So the finished product, is there trout fishing along that stretch? Is that like an area that you can catch fish and not have to worry about contamination of the fish or something like that?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, imagine this dam was basically a barrier to fish migrating from the middle Clark Fork into the upper Clark Fork as well as the Blackfoot River for over 100 years. Wow. That reservoir environment that was formed as a result of the impoundment basically favored mostly non-native species, including pike.
Right.
And there was some cultural attachment with the town of Bonner to that environment. I mean, there were a lot of folks that resisted removal of the dam and just seeing change on the landscape. And we certainly understood that going into the project. So, balancing expectations from a design standpoint, but also socially was an equal challenge. And fortunately, the state and federal agencies managed most of that expectation for us.
Gotcha. So how quickly did you see some of the native species kind of taking advantage of?
Immediately.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it was immediate response. We literally, the removal of that dam opened up hundreds of miles of, riverine habitat that was formerly truncated as a result of the dam.
Wow. Okay. So, what I find interesting about this type of work, a few years ago, I was in China for a conference talking about water, and there was a lot of folks, not only from China, but from India, in Bangladesh, and the talk there is all about building new dams. That is like they are really in a heyday of building a lot of new dams, and I just I think about where we are, and I wonder if that movement will kind of spread over there, because dam constructions, it's also a more in some ways a very political act, and it relates to regional power, because one country's got the dam and then this other country's downstream, and so it gets tangled in their relations. But do you see this happening in Europe or any other part of the world where people are, taking a look at dams and saying, well, this one has kind of outlived its usefulness, and so maybe it'd be better if we didn't have it?
I can't imagine that won't be the trend. I don't follow what's happening very closely globally, but I can imagine that's going to have to be the trend, because they're going to face similar situations that, we have in the U.S. with these antiquated, facilities that are posing a risk to public health and safety, and not, they've outlived their useful life.
Right. So we've been focusing on dams here, but you also manage wetlands restoration projects. So let's talk a little bit about those. Are those projects, do you do wetlands creation? Are you restoring wetlands? Do you do a combination? What do you work on?
We do a combination, so creation as well as restoration. A lot of the large-scale wetland restoration projects we actually have performed are directly, ironically, related to mitigation requirements associated with hydro facilities.
Okay.
So, for example, when Kerr Dam was built at the outlet of Flathead Lake, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service acquired multiple national wildlife refuges as well as waterfowl production areas in northwest Montana, and they were required as part of the licensing of that dam, or the facility was required to pay the mitigation. So we've worked on several large Lost Trail National Wildlife Refuge. We're just underway this week actually on the Swan National Wildlife Refuge out of Swan Lake, Montana, restoring these broad wetland environments that were previously drained and cleared for agricultural production. So ironically, the hydro facility mitigation funds are being used to restore these degraded wetland habitats. Probably the best example we have to describe today is our work down in the Madison River Valley in a small town called Ennis, Montana. Northwestern Energy owns and maintains two large hydro facilities, both on Ennis Lake as well as Hebgen Lake near Yellowstone National Park. So as part of their licensing, they're required to mitigate for impacts related to fish and wildlife resources on both the Madison and Missouri River, and I believe they are on the hook for about 55 miles of river mitigation. And so over the past 18 years, my firm's worked very closely with Northwestern Energy, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and of course, private landowners to restore about 1,000 acres of previously drained, emergent, and shallow to deep open water wetland habitats on the Odell Spring Creek area, which is a major cold water tributary to the Madison River just south of Ennis, Montana. So that's been a remarkable partnership, a remarkable project, and the fact that we had two willing landowners that allowed us basically free reign to, restore all the degraded wetlands. And we've seen just a significant response in terms of wildlife and waterfowl use. We've partnered with the University of Montana, their bird ecology center, to study waterfowl response. And it's just amazing to see how the landscape's transformed.
So anybody who listens to this podcast regularly knows I'm a big fan of wetlands, and started out my career working on wetlands. And so, that's great to hear, because, I keep looking at all the big problems that we're trying to deal with related to water, and a lot of them related to climate and biodiversity loss. And, the answer keeps coming up, wetlands, even for flooding and things like that. And your work restoring wetlands and creating wetlands, do you, I guess, early on when people were creating wetlands I was studying this in the 80s, a lot of times they were like using the uplands and all that, and it might work or might not. And I imagine that whole field has really advanced quite a bit since then.
It has. And, when people think about wetland restoration, they sometimes imagine, and some of the work is performed this way, large earth-moving operations, generating open water features, and then they have to supplement the wetlands with, irrigation water, because those are areas that didn't formally support wetland habitat. In the case of Odell Creek and the refuges we've worked on, those wetlands were largely drained just through land clearing and ditching. So in the case of the Odell Spring Creek, they literally dug a ditch and incised the river channel back in the 1940s to drain the land so that they could increase hay production and run cattle. And so a lot of the wetland restoration at Odell and these other projects has just simply involved reconnecting the Spring Creek and these river channels with their historical floodplains that have been disconnected because of those physical alterations to the landscape. In the case of Odell Creek, it's been about 19 miles of Spring Creek restoration where we've raised the channel several feet to reconnect those former wetland surfaces, and the seed's there. I mean, you just have to restore the hydrology in some cases, and the vegetation's going to respond, and that's largely been the case with Odell Creek and certainly the refuges we've worked on up here in northwest Montana.
And it sounds like a lot of those areas are areas that are open to the public eventually.
They are. I mean, of course, the national wildlife refuges and the waterfowl production areas are open to the public for, viewing wildlife, hunting, fishing, etc. Yeah,
so when we finish, I'm going to have to ask you about Swan Lake because I duck up there some, so I want to find out where that project is. Let's go on a little bit to your role as mayor. I have to first say that you're the only hydrologist I know who's a mayor or in an office, high profile office, at least in Texas. I don't know any hydrologists. And so as somebody who every once in a while thinks, I wonder if I should throw my hat in the ring for something or, get involved more. It's not something that part of your career is not something you see folks who are scientists and engineers, take too often. And I find now that, I do most of my work I do is related to public policy. And so I'm just curious about that. What was that like for you? Having this very different background and then, deciding to get involved with, civic responsibilities as mayor.
I certainly didn't envision this to be my life path the last 16 years. I didn't have any political aspirations. I was serving, about 16 years ago as vice chairman of the Whitefish Lake and Lakeshore Protection Committee, which is a volunteer committee, much like mayorships volunteer here in Whitefish as well. We're not paid. I was serving on that committee in the capacity of just reviewing permits and doing construction inspections, et cetera. And there was a vacancy on the city council, and I was asked to throw my name in the ring, and I was fortunate to have been appointed, I think back in 2006, to that city council, and then I ran successfully for a 4-year city council term before throwing my name in the ring for mayor. And I'm fortunate to have served now. I'm on my 11th year, on my third term, so I have 1.5 more years left on my third term, and it's been very rewarding. But it certainly wasn't a goal of mine when I moved to Whitefish to become mayor of this town.
Well, I had no idea you weren't paid because there's a lot of action going on here in Whitefish for a small town.
There certainly is, and that's in our charter, and the only way to change that is through a change in the charter, which needs to come from the public by the people.
Well, as a part-time resident of Whitefish, I thank you.
You're welcome
for doing all that. So, thinking about Whitefish and, the kind of size city that it is, what are some of the water projects that you're working on in your capacity as mayor? What are some of the things that are going on here?
Quite a bit. I mean, obviously, we're surrounded by water. I mean, we live on the lake. We derive about 15% of our municipal water supply from Whitefish Lake. The rest comes from Haskell Basin, two surface water sources that originate on the Whitefish Range. But we've had a long-standing commitment to water projects. I'll start with aquatic invasive species. Obviously, this is a prized gem in whitefish. It's one of the biggest economic drivers to our community, and the thought of the introduction of zebra mussels, for example, to this lake water body would be devastating to our water supply, and obviously the high property values that we see around Whitefish Lake. We are a little bit ahead of the state years ago in the fact that we actually helped fund and develop our own aquatic invasive species program here in Whitefish that was managed by our partners, Whitefish Lake Institute, a nonprofit organization, kind of the watchdog of Whitefish Lake, in partnership with the city of Whitefish. So years ago, we launched our own aquatic invasive species, check station program, and we currently have one about 200 yards at the city beach boat launch, as well as the state park boat launch, on the west shore of Whitefish Lake. That's been largely successful. We've had, multiple partners help us with the funding because, of course, it requires staffing and infrastructure. We have our own decontamination station that's stationed here at City Beach. And of course, we have strong partnerships with the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Division, as well as the tribal entities up in the Blackfeet Nation.
So 5-6 years ago, I was spending a lot of time on this in Texas. And representing one of the river authorities when we were working with Texas Parks and Wildlife, trying to figure out, how do we stop the spread of zebra mussels? And it was, we were not, very successful, I hate to say. And, we relied, for the most part, on kind of a campaign of, public information, mostly for, trying to target people who do a lot of boating. And a lot of the boating, people will take their bass boat and they'll go from one lake to another. And, and so that's how you end up, spreading zebra mussels. I'm really been impressed that you've been able to do that here. I think it seems like it probably helps to have, a small number of, I guess, access points to the lake.
Sure.
But
the bigger risk with that is when on the one hand, you have very limited access points, but you also have several hundred residences with private docks on the lake, many of which are Canadian residents that come down from British Columbia, et cetera. And so our partners that are running the more regional check stations are obviously instrumental in protecting this lake because they intercept those boats well before we do.
So I took my test and I got my certificate.
Good.
I passed it. And
Online?
I did, yep. And I put a sticker on one of our paddle boards, I think is what I put on. And so, I thought that was great that, people have to take that short test and just learn enough to it's all common sense stuff, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Really absolutely. And I can't neglect to bring this project up, but I think one of Whitefish's watershed moments and probably the most rewarding job I've worked on as mayor in partnership with our community has been the protection of Haskell Basin. This was a project that we worked with in partnership with the Trust for Public Land, the U.S. Forest Service, and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Back in 2016, the deal was closed, and it essentially lifted the development rights off about 3,000 acres of forested watershed in Haskell Basin. And as I mentioned earlier, the city derives about 90% of its municipal water supply from those two intakes on Haskell Basin. And for about 100 years, on little more than a handshake agreement with the landowner, F.H. Stoltz Land and Lumber Company, the city's been maintaining and operating those, head gates and diversions that deliver water down to our water treatment plant in Haskell Basin. So the time was right. The stars aligned. We were approached by the Trust for Public Land, an incredible project manager, Alex Diekman, who is a steadfast conservationist here in Montana. And over the course of about 3 years, we were able to generate funding, about $19.6 million, to essentially close the deal and lift the development rights off those lands. Why that was so important was over the years, F.H. Stoltz Land and Lumber Company had been kind of shaving slivers of land off for high-end development, such as the Iron Horse development, as well as for expansion of the Big Mountain ski area. And we saw those actions as threats to our water supply for good reason. So I think that was a significant project, not only in the fact that we secured our watershed supply in perpetuity, or water supply, but it also guaranteed permanent public access to those lands for our residents as well as visitors.
I've been using them.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful. We've partnered with our other nonprofit friend, Whitefish Legacy Partners. They've developed an amazing trail network in and around Whitefish.
It goes all the way, I guess it now goes all the way around the lake.
Almost.
Doesn't it?
That's the goal. Yeah.
Okay.
The goal is to circumnavigate Whitefish Lake, but that Haskell Basin piece was a critical missing link, because we wanted to integrate the Whitefish Trail in with the city's master plan for bikes and pedestrian trails. And so ultimately, that deal also allowed us to build about a 5-mile recreational trail from our trailhead in city up to the ski hill.
Okay.
And that was dedicated to the city by Stoltz for $1 for the easement.
Oh, wow.
So we actually own that trail and fee simple.
That's wonderful. And if you're, if you're trying to figure out what ski mountain it is, because we probably call it Big Mountain.
I always call it Big Mountain.
I do too.
It's still big.
It's still big. It's now more commonly referred to as Whitefish Mountain. And I made the mistake, as a little aside here, but I gave away some of my Big Mountain swag when I realized, we had some young friends who lived here, and they saw some and they say, "Hey, do you want that?" And I was like, "Go ahead and take it." Now I kind of wish I still had it, but the other projects, so that's part of you're talking about Haskell Basin. That's part of your future water supply, or expansion of your future water supply, or what's that project?
So that was securing the water supply.
Okay, just
so
securing
we've derived our water for about 100 years from those lands.
Okay.
So it was permanent conservation easement that allows us now to maintain those diversions and operate our water treatment plant in perpetuity. So we think about water infrastructure typically as, the piping, the treatment plant, the filters. But in this case, our water supply is a forested watershed.
Right.
And so we wanted to harness the ability to have those lands continue to be managed for sustainable forest products by a very reputable private timber company, F.H. Stoltz, in perpetuity. And it's a win-win for them, because obviously they received a financial gain, but they can also continue managing the forest, employ over 100 people locally here with good paying jobs.
That's great. That's great. And the upper part of the watershed was already preserved. And so, there's a lot of this watershed that's preserved now.
Yeah, we're very fortunate. In Flathead County alone, about 90% of the land base is public land. Huh. We're surrounded by F.H. Stoltz Land and Lumber Company, Flathead National Forest lands, DNRC, state lands, and a lot of our success with our trail program has involved a very strong partnership with the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, where we've purchased easements as well as licenses to build and maintain our trail network in and around Whitefish.
So do you also have a wastewater treatment project underway?
We just completed that.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a 3-year project. We were on a lagoon system for decades. And because the Whitefish River is listed for nutrients, it's an impaired water body, identified as impaired by the Department of Environmental Quality as part of the Clean Water Act. We were required to upgrade, much like many municipalities throughout the country, our treatment capacity and capability. So just last year, we finished that major capital project. It was about $22 million, which was a very heavy lift for this community. We leveraged several state and federal grants to, take the burden off our taxpayers, but ultimately we did have to increase, sewer rates to some degree. but we went with a fairly innovative technology called a sequencing batch reactor that is state of the art and will certainly help improve and will certainly meet our discharge permit requirements on the Whitefish River as a result of that project.
So tell us a little bit about how that technology works.
You'd have to ask our public works director. But yeah, a lot of capital projects over the years, and similarly, we just finished adding capacity at our water treatment plant in Haskell Basin. Just this past year, we increased our water treatment capacity from 3 million gallons per day upwards now of 5 to 6 million gallons per day, with the ability to easily expand that in the future, because that alone was about an $11 million lift that we had to put on hard on the backs of our taxpayers.
Gotcha. And population here's what?
It's about 7,000 year-round residents, but at any given time, we ramp up to 22,000 in the summer, in large part because of our proximity to Glacier National Park.
Right. I was going to say, it's August. I know driving over here, there's a lot more than 7,000 here right now. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, let's go ahead and wrap up, John. And why don't you tell us how our listeners can find out more about the River Design Group and about, the city of Whitefish?
Well, pretty simply, it's just www.riverdesigngroup.com and cityofwhitefish.org. And both sites will provide plenty of information on both the ongoings at City Hall, which is ever more consuming of my time, as is my company. So they're good resources to check out. Great.
Well, I really enjoyed talking with you today and, learning more about your background and finding out what the city's doing. And so, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
This has been Talk+Water, and my guest today was John Muhlfeld, Principal Hydrologist of the River Design Group based in Whitefish, Montana, and John's also the Mayor of the City of Whitefish, Montana. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in, and to say if you enjoyed this episode of Talk+Water, please let us know by giving it a like. And that's it. My name's Todd Votteler. Let's talk water again soon.